Wow. Thank you, Orly, for this fascinating presentation. I think it's really relevant to a lot of people in the world, since so many of us are indoors more than we were before. And a lot of the world is indoors right now. So these kinds of approaches are going to be really helpful for a lot of reasons. But now we have just another 10 to 13 minutes of questions for these last two presenters. We'd like to focus there. So any questions for Peter Peterson and for Orly Stanford, please put them in the chat box, and I'll look at the ones that have already been submitted and pose those questions. So for Peter, there are lots of questions about the bike data and some of the factors you might have run into, for instance, biking speed or the inlet and how the air inlet, how it was designed in order to come up with consistent, fewer variables as you collect that data. Let's start there.
So with the cycling speed, the inlet.
Yes.
Yeah, so the inlet design was designed so it was collect air perpendicular to the direction of motion. And we had tested different designs, and the one that was deployed in Buenos Aires worked very well, and we saw no correlation with speed. Because these sensors are fundamentally based on the amount of air that goes in and the rate that it goes in. And so it was really important to ensure that speed didn't cause any effect, and thankfully it didn't within the realms of cycling. So that was fine.
Super. Similarly, what about the time of day the data were collected? Like during rush hour, during higher temperature, other things like that?
The cyclists, they cycle throughout all hours of the day, and when we plotted the average exposure throughout the network over different times, yes, you would naturally see spikes at like rush hours and at night when, for atmospheric reasons, when you would have more PM at night. But given the way that we produced the maps from the baseline removal, like rush hour periods were naturally kind of filtered out, except regions which were naturally very dense in pollution. And that would be very much shown in the maps, as was shown in the second example, when I said there was a very congested street, and it was likely being settled in that region because it was a very small junction.
Mm-hmm. Someone commented that they thought that as the cyclists were collecting data, that you would see more hotspots, maybe as you approached higher traffic roads or just more density. And they were surprised that the maps didn't show more hotspots.
So the data we showed was for the entire time period, just to show kind of hotspots that were consistent throughout the entire month. If we were to splice the data into hours of the day, then I think we would naturally see hotspots arising from traffic or other factors. But I didn't show that today.
I see. That's helpful to know. Just a different, you can present the information using different variables. One last one for now for you, Peter, is how are you trying to harmonize measurements between different sensor types?
So we've experimented with a bunch of different sensors. And so we began with the Novatech sensor, which I think was quite popularly used and is still used today. And we were content with it until we realized that as soon as you got any light near the inlet, it would introduce a spike to the data. And of course, we didn't want like a very sunny day to be suddenly mistaken to be very high pollution. So we just disregarded that sensor. Then we tried the plant tower ones, and they were fine. But the problem was that the documentation was a bit sparse. And at the time when we were designing the Buenos Aires project, the Sensorion sensor was on the market, and their data sheet was very comprehensible, and it seemed to be very much in line with what we were looking for. And on top of that, the factory calibration was really beneficial, and as shown, that really helped us. Funny.
Um, all right, so now I have some questions for Orly. I think of these as a lot of questions related to the indoor environment. Like, how do you think ceiling height affects indoor air quality? Did you look at human traffic within the sensor range? And any other kind of different ways of measuring and other factors that you take into account that we haven't really discussed as much for all of these other participants who are looking outdoors?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I think there are a lot of factors that can impact the indoor-outdoor ratio. And in the pilot study, it was just 5 schools for a couple weeks, so we didn't look at those factors. I did take a quick look at, I was curious about the variability between different classrooms and if, the ones that showed much lower levels, had no students in those rooms at that time versus the ones that showed higher levels. And there wasn't actually a clear distinction that I saw there. But yeah, for looking at things like building age and different HVAC systems and filtration and that people have brought up, I think to do that, you'd probably need a much larger study that compares a lot of different building types. For this, I'm really interested in kind of taking a deep dive at seeing how the low-cost sensors perform and what meaning can come from looking at the indoor-outdoor ratio at 2 schools specifically. So I don't think I'll be able to answer those kinds of questions with the study, but I think that they're really important, and I definitely need to look into those factors more to interpret the indoor-outdoor ratios.
All right, a couple more questions for you that are not just about the kind of inputs, but also now about the analysis and another question later about kind of actions. So on the analysis side, what are your thoughts on the wide variability of input-output ratios? I'm sorry, indoor-outdoor ratios at very low outdoor PM concentrations? Because on the graphs, it looks like the ratios span the full range of 0 to 1, and it's hard to interpret. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so I think a big part of that is when the outdoor levels are really low, I think that the ratios look artificially high. So I think that's part of it. And so I've been wondering what to do about that. Like if I should have a threshold, I just don't look at data when the outdoor PM 2.5 levels are too low. And then I think another impact is indoor generated sources of particulate matter. So students moving around and kicking up dust from the carpet, or maybe some combustion coming from a cafeteria or something like that, or printers. There's a lot of potential indoor sources of particulate matter too. But I think that the artificially high ratios at those really low concentrations are also making a big difference.
Thanks. Now here's a question that relates kind of again to your input, what I see as kind of inputs in, as well as analysis, and that is, you have feedback from teachers and students on where they smell wood smoke inside the school during events. Our noses are very sensitive and can detect things at very low concentrations. And the concentrations would vary even within different rooms of the school and on different sides of the building and so on. Any ideas about using human sensory techniques or data to correlate or otherwise interpret your information?
I think that's a great idea. Right now, we don't have plans to do that, but I'm really open to working with the school personnel and seeing if there's interest in that kind of thing. I'm trying to balance, interesting, useful work with burden on teachers and students. But if they were interested, I think that would be a really great thing to look at. I guess I can just provide one example of getting feedback. It's not from teachers and students, but we had one custodian in the pilot study who mentioned that whenever they change out the filters on the north side of the building, they notice that the filters are dirtier compared to the south side of the building. And so that would be an example of something we would take into account for interpretation.
So many variables, and it's really hard to do these experiments, so to speak, with having fewer variables at a time and with a smaller sample size. So it's really your experiment design is really critical here. Regarding kind of putting the data into action, someone asked if you've explored the effectiveness of using vegetative buffers around schools and the impact of that. Is that something you took into account?
No, it's not, but that's a really interesting idea, and I've heard of that before, but I didn't think about it for this project, so I'll look into that.
Yeah, I mean, that's the kind of thing that you maybe can figure out post-experiment, you know, even if you didn't set it up that way. You can use the observational information you just had, like about which sides of the building might have more particulates. You could do that post-facto maybe, just kind of qualitatively. I'm looking ahead, looking back at some other questions that might be cross-cutting. Yes, I'm just thinking of there's many questions we received. Thank you for all these questions. This has been just spectacular for us. We hope you're finding ways to learning about this whole topic area from our participants. I'm going to look quickly at the questions and the latest questions in the chat, but it looks like we've kind of crowdsourced some of these answers as well. I think actually this is a good point, even though we haven't. Yeah, one last question for Peter about what your next steps are on research, and then we'll just do a quick wrap before going over time, so we don't go over time. Just quickly, Peter, next steps on your research.
So we're intending to expand to other cities around the world. We have a few pilots going on in other areas in Latin America and Africa. So our main aim is to enable people and to make sure that the data that comes out of these pilots has an impact on policy and on the people. Short, to enable kind of behavioral changes to improve the quality of the air that people breathe. But in terms of research, we're actively looking into different ways of analyzing the data and also looking at ways to improve the hardware to make it more user-friendly.
Yes, great. I don't know if Sandra, if you want to wrap this up and close this out. What I'm going to do is just put the URL from the page where people can get these recordings in the chat.